Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thank you for joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started even as we have several more colleagues still joining us. Welcome. So welcome to another Million Lives Collective event. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, we're delighted to have you here and we hope you enjoyed today's discussion and networking opportunities. Today's event is co-hosted by Farm Radio International, and we will focus on exploring the topics of monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive learning for scaling innovations. Really important topics in today's context. My name is Megan Kennedy-Chouane. I'm the head of the evaluation unit in the Development Co-operation Directorate of the OECD. And today I'm also wearing my hat of one of the coordinators of the COVID-19 Global Evaluation Coalition, which is an independent collaborative made up of the evaluation units from international development agencies and governments around the world. And we are working to support credible, independent assessment of COVID response, recovery, and response efforts. It's a real pleasure to be here today with all of you. And it's a delight for me to be able to connect with so many interesting partners and to learn from all of you. So without further ado, we will dive right into today's event. A couple of points on housekeeping, however. We now are, looks like, over 50 participants, and we're expecting perhaps as many as 100 or more today. So you will see that there is an option at the bottom of your screen for interpretation. Merci, bienvenue. Vous pouvez choisir l'option d'écouter aujourd'hui l'événement en français ou en anglais. Merci de choisir votre langue préférée en dessous de l'écran. Thank you. And a big thank you to our interpreters today for their support, which allows us to have a much more open and inclusive conversation. So please go ahead and select your preferred channel for the presentations today at the bottom of your screen. We would like you to please keep your microphones off and muted for the first part of the event to avoid any news interferences. And of course, the colleagues, technical colleagues will also support in muting anyone who accidentally comes off of mute. This event is being recorded. If you would prefer not to be recorded, you can leave your camera off. Otherwise, if your connection allows for it, it's nice to see your faces. So please do feel free to turn on your camera. After the presentations and the speakers, we will have some opportunities throughout the discussion to answer your questions. So please go ahead and put those questions as they arrive into the chat, and I will do my best to make sure that we get to all of your questions. We also have a mechanism for you to reach out to the speakers and the partners that you'll be hearing from today in follow-up. So if we don't get a chance to get to your questions, which might be the case, our apologies in advance, but we will do our best to follow up with you after the event. So a couple of words about the organizers of the event. The Millennium Lives Collective is an initiative that recognizes and raises awareness of innovators and social entrepreneurs, making a significant impact in addressing global development challenges. The MLC is based on the belief that collectively highlighting the work of innovators and social entrepreneurs that have scaled to transformative numbers of clients will act as a powerful platform to celebrate, learn, and increase impact among members and beyond. You can find more information on how to join this initiative in the chat. Farm Radio International is a member of Million Lives Collective and is an NGO that provides quality radio through existing infrastructure. We'll be hearing a lot more about their work in a few moments. So diving into the topic of today's session and our objectives. Monitoring, evaluation, and learning are topics we all deal with in the global development community. And that is my own area of expertise and about what my passion and my professional work is all about. I think we've all recognized the imperative of learning and accountability for actual impacts. We have to look beyond good intention, beyond amount of finance spent, or beyond good policies, and actually look at whether we're making a difference in people's lives and whether we're supporting sustainable, impactful interventions and policies. I just was reading today a short article about child poverty in my own home country in the United States, and it was emphasizing the importance of effectiveness of policies, that in increasing effectiveness of policies is behind an impressive historic drop in child poverty in the US. And I think it was a great reminder to me of the importance of looking beyond simple numbers of what we've attempted to achieve in terms of reach or in terms of delivery, but to actually look at outcomes and impacts. And what we'll hear about today is some of the exciting examples of how this can be done in ways that are participatory and support scaling, as well as innovation and community engagement. So today we're looking at these issues of balance. Of course, we can always overdo it. And as we also say in my home country, you don't fatten a pig by measuring it. So we're not just about measuring things for the sake of measuring it, but in fact, we want to be using our measurement, monitoring, and evaluation tools to help improve our work and achieve greater impact, including deepening our partnerships and ownership of local communities. So we'll have two parts of the discussion today. The first part, and most of our time, will be with hearing from several presentations on the topic. We'll start with some background on monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive learning for scaling innovation from our colleague Katie Bowman from the Results for Development. We will then, and again, while Katie's talking, please feel free to put your questions into the chat. We will hear from Bernard Pelletier from Farm Radio International and Vijay Pretap from Gram Vaani, who will both share practical examples and reflect on their own experiences from their organization. And then this will be followed by an informal networking opportunity where we will break into smaller breakout rooms for discussion, exploration of the key themes and questions that have come up, and hopefully hearing from all of you as well. And at the end, in about an hour and 25 minutes, we'll come back together for some quick closing remarks and end today's session. So let me start by introducing the stellar lineup of speakers that we have today. And they will be with us to take us towards our goal, which is that you will learn something new, hopefully also share something new with all of us so that we can learn as well. Let me first introduce you to Katie Bowman. She's an Associate Director of the Evaluation and Adaptive Learning team at Results for Development. She has over 8 years of experience leading projects across the globe, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. She's a proven leader in systems thinking and collaborative learning who believes firmly in adaptive, iterative approaches. So I'm also delighted to introduce Bernard Pelletier. So welcome, Katie. Welcome, Katie. Maybe you want to give us a wave. Also delighted to introduce Bernard Pelletier is a senior managing specialist from Farm Radio. He oversees all of the monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning activities at Farm Radio, which, as you will hear about shortly, is an impressive portfolio of activities. From 2000 to 2016, Bernard was a research associate, lecturer, and manager at McGill University. And then we would also like to introduce you to Vijay Pretap, co-founder and CEO of Gram Vaani, which is a social tech enterprise that builds innovative, voice-based community media technologies for the underserved. So welcome to all of you. We're delighted to have such a distinguished panel. So let me go ahead and turn over to Katie. I'd like to welcome you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and bear with me while I just share my screen here. All right, so you heard from Megan that we are here to talk about monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive learning today. And there's over 100 of you on the line. I'm sure many or most of you are very familiar with monitoring and evaluation, M&E, MEL, however you want to call it. You might be a little bit less familiar with the phrase adaptive learning. So I want to spend a few minutes at the start of our presentations today describing to you what adaptive learning is and how it is different from traditional M&E. And if you can just bear with me one moment here, just having an issue with my share screen. And I wonder if I can get help from the tech team to share these slides, as I've just had an issue with my share screen. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Let me know, Katie, when I should go to the next slide, please.
Yeah, feel free. Please advance. And one more. Perfect. So as I was saying, you might be more familiar with traditional M&E, maybe less so with adaptive learning. And when I think about traditional M&E, you might think about going on a journey with a static map. You think about where you're starting. You might plot out your journey to get to your final destination. And that's it. You're going to follow that path. You may come across some traffic, you may come across an accident, but that's the path you've mapped out. And at the end, you might decide, I wish I had taken a different route, but I've learned for the next time I go on a trip. On the other side, adaptive learning is more akin to many of the apps people use these days, such as Waze or Google Maps, where you are getting real-time information that's allowing you to see what the best route is to take. So that map is going to show you there's an accident here, let's take a different road to go around it, or there's some traffic this way, let's take a different route. And so adaptive learning is similar in allowing you to recalibrate while you are on your journey to make sure you're taking the most efficient, effective way to reach your desired end destination, or in our case, to reach your desired impact. You can move along to the next slide, please. So there's been sort of an evolution, if I could say, from traditional M&E towards more adaptive learning approaches over the past years. And I want to describe a bit what some of those distinctions are. So in traditional M&E, traditional monitoring and evaluation, there is often this focus on accountability. You might receive funding from a funder who wants to make sure that you are spending those funds appropriately on what you set out to do, and tracking your progress as you go along. Adaptive learning is less focused on accountability, and it's more focused on that learning piece. So it's less about a requirement or reporting to your funder. It's more about learning so that you can do the best work possible, so that you can achieve your goals and your impact that you've set out to achieve. So it's learning for learning's sake to improve your work and to make it most efficient and most effective. Rather than traditional M&E, which often has external evaluators coming in to assess a given project, often at the end of implementation. On the other side, adaptive learning is really about working closely with the doers, those who are actually implementing an innovation, and allowing them to drive the key questions, the key research questions, the key learning questions, to help answer some of those biggest unknowns or biggest areas of uncertainty. And speaking of uncertainty, adaptive learning is really designed to help us better contend with the complex environments within which we're working. I know many of you are probably focused on launching, testing, and scaling innovations in complex ecosystems. And knowing that those complex ecosystems are always evolving and changing, adaptive learning allows us to pick up information about that changing environment and adjust our approach accordingly. It's getting back to that recalibration that I mentioned as we're going along our journey. Next slide, please. So you might wonder, great, adaptive learning is learning for learning's sake. It's going to allow me to reach my goals, to achieve my impacts better, faster. But what am I actually doing? What are the methods I'm using? Well, with adaptive learning, the focus isn't on one method. It's not a given method for that method's sake. So we're not just focused on, say, impact evaluation. Rather, it's more about taking this sort of mixology approach, and it's more about leading with the key questions that the innovators or the implementers have, and focusing on what your level of certainty is. If you have a lot of uncertainty, you're just getting started, then you don't need a lot of rigor in terms of the methods that you're using to answer your key questions. But as you move along and as you continue to test, replicate, scale, you might have increased certainty about your innovation, and then you can move to greater level of rigor in terms of your learning activities. So if you have a mobile app, an innovation using a mobile app, and you're launching that in a new environment, you may start with some really low level rigor, formative research to understand the mobile penetration, to have some key informant interviews with intended users. And that might be enough to answer your questions at the start. However, as you move on, you might have increased certainty that your mobile app is going to work, but you might have questions about the messaging that you're going to use with your intended users. Then you might want to do some lean testing and compare one type of message versus another and get some feedback from those intended users. And as you move along, you can increase your level of rigor in your methods that you're using based on the certainty that you have. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. So what does this look like in practice? You know that there's a variety of methods we can use. We want to calibrate our level of rigor based on our level of certainty in our innovation. But when you get started, usually when we have an adaptive learning engagement, we kick off a co-creation process where we develop a theory of change. And everything we do is grounded in this theory of change because it allows us to map out our pathways to impact, and it allows us to understand how we expect our activities to get us to our intended impact. And once we do that, once we co-create this theory of change with key stakeholders in the given ecosystem, we then can start to pull out what are those unknowns or those assumptions that are implicit in that theory of change. Where are we making an assumption about how a given activity will connect to a given outcome? And once we've identified those given assumptions, those can serve as the basis for clarifying our learning questions or our research questions. And so where we have the biggest areas of uncertainty, we can make sure to pinpoint those areas to serve as the basis for our experimentations and to test out different alternatives. So we might have in our minds 2 options that we want to compare, and we decide to test those out, and then we'll go back to our theory of change and update it accordingly. Throughout this entire process, we like to hold what we call learning checks. Really, that's an opportunity to bring together all of the relevant stakeholders and local actors with whom we're working to make sense of the findings. If we've led some experimental process or we've gathered some data, we want to bring all of those findings together with key stakeholders to make sense of the information. We want to combine that information with the tacit knowledge of local actors and make sense of it together to figure out how we want to pivot. So it's where we connect the data to decision making. That's the learning checks. And that's a really key process in adaptive learning because it's closing the feedback loop. As I said, connecting the data to decision making. So ultimately, an adaptive learning process starts by understanding the problem, understanding the local system within which you're working, and then moving from that to testing for the solution, determining where we have areas of uncertainty and where we want to test different options to figure out what might work best. Once we figure out what might work best, we can learn and we can iterate or pivot our approach accordingly. And so our adaptive learning engagement, it's probably not going to be a straight line. We'll have lots of pivots as we go, but that'll get us to our end goal rather than waiting to the end to figure out it didn't work. So that's where we get to better information faster so that we have an efficient, effective innovation. You can move forward, thank you. So you might wonder, is this always going to be useful to me? When should I be using adaptive learning versus traditional M&E? Certainly traditional M&E still has a place and we still value that. So adaptive learning can be a really good fit for new and untested innovations as they're introduced into complex systems. I mentioned those complex systems are constantly evolving, and so we need to evolve our approach as we're working within that evolving environment. If we're thinking about testing multiple program options, that's a great time to use adaptive learning because it allows us to be nimble and lean with our testing and experimentation to compare multiple options rather than going with one and deciding at the end through evaluation whether it was successful or not. So testing as we move from idea to scale is a great time to employ adaptive learning. And it helps us assess an intervention's likelihood to accelerate impact. So it helps us rule out some non-starters and figure out where are some, it helps us ultimately fail fast and figure out what's not going to work so that we can pivot and employ some other approach that will be more effective. So I'm going to stop there. I know we'll have more time to discuss in breakout groups, but I want to pass it on to my other presenters so that you can get a sense of the work that they're doing through their innovations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katie. And please do put your questions for Katie into the chat. If you have just joined us, merci d'être là, bienvenue. Si vous souhaitez écouter aujourd'hui en français, vous pouvez choisir la langue French. Dans votre écran, en bas, il y a un petit cercle. Donc, vous pouvez choisir français pour écouter les interprètes aujourd'hui. Et merci d'avance aux interprètes. Thank you so much, Katie. I was just reiterating that there is interpretation available today in French. If you'd like to choose your language at the bottom of the screen, please go ahead. So I really thought it was interesting, Katie, especially your points around matching the level of certainty and the level of rigor, and that we actually think of monitoring evaluation approaches as being a whole range of tools. I often kind of shudder at this idea of traditional monitoring and evaluation, and in some ways I hope that nobody ever actually did do those traditional things, because they seem rather ill-adapted to most of the problems we face and we work on every day. So I really like this idea of looking at, right-sizing the tools we're using to the challenges we have and learning as we go. So let's hear a little bit more now about what this really looks like in practice. We'll turn now to Bernard. Thank you for being here. And Bernard, let's hear how you approach these issues at Farm Radio. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you everyone for attending the webinar. So it's a pleasure for me to share some of the monitoring and evaluation work done at Farm Radio International, and with this kind of particular focus here on adaptive learning and the extent to which we are bringing some of these elements in our work. So in this presentation, basically, I'll give a brief overview of Farm Radio International's mission, the vision, how our projects are typically structured, and how we conceptualize impact. Now, I'll give a few examples of indicators that we typically include in our project, but then I'll focus mostly on this kind of interactive component, this interactive radio component, which I believe can contribute to a process of adaptive learning, and then we can look into that. So Farm Radio, and sorry if the slides may seem a bit busy, but I've put both French and English there, so you can choose where to read. But our mission is to have prosperous, just, and vibrant rural African people and communities. To accomplish this, our vision is to make radio a powerful force for good in rural Africa. One that shares knowledge, amplifies voices, and supports positive change. To do this, the work is basically around supporting radio broadcasters and key stakeholders in implementing interactive radio program as part of knowledge sharing platforms that can drive positive change and improve quality of life. So our work covers many aspects of rural development: agriculture, nutrition, education, sexual and reproductive health, gender equality, climate adaptation, and so on. And more recently, some work done around the COVID-19 pandemic and around COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. We have currently a large project in 16 countries looking at the issue of a vaccine for COVID-19. So typically, I mean, every project is slightly different, but typically a Farm Radio project will involve some formative research conducted to gather information from stakeholders and rural communities in terms of their priorities, listening habits, access to information, issues related to gender dynamics and things like that. And this information then informs a participatory process of involving, again, key stakeholders, broadcasters, rural communities, in identifying the content and also the design of the radio programs that will go on air. The building of these platforms also involves some capacity building around for broadcasters and other stakeholders and rural communities, let's say, for example, through listener groups and things like that, that will facilitate their involvement and participation in these knowledge sharing and dialogue platforms. Then the radio program itself is aired following based on quality standard that Farm Radio International has come up with to try to make sure that we were meeting certain objectives in terms of quality of programming. And then an important part of that, and that's going to be the focus a bit of my presentation, is around this interactivity part. These different approaches that are put in place to facilitate interactions between listeners and the radio program or the implementers of the radio program on an ongoing basis. So this whole process, I think it's important to highlight, is informed by like a gender strategy that will allow us to fully address the barriers, the concerns of women in terms of both in terms of the like project implementation activities, but also in terms of the content and that is being discussed and during these radio programs. So what do we see as impact for Farm Radio International? Then let's just look at some of the indicators in a way that we typically use. And some in a way would be tackled in like what we seem to be calling traditional M&E, and then we can come back to that. So because of we work with radio, one of the key characteristics of working with radio station is this potential to reach a large number of people and then contribute to the scaling of solutions or innovations. So one indicator that we use to assess that reach is what we call the potential audience, which is basically the number of people living in the zone that is covered by the radio stations. And this is assessed through a combination of mapping the coverage of these different radio stations, plus overlaying that with some demographic data to have a sense, okay, how many people have the potential to be reached by these radio programs. Then listenership rate, of course, we're interested to say out of that potential audience, how many people actually listen to the program, the frequency of listening and things like that. So we have measures around the listenership rate. And this is usually kind of measure or assessed through surveys. So then we get this, we are able then to do an estimation of the real, I would say, real audience. Then after that, there's typically like these changes in knowledge, attitude, and practices that we want to monitor to see the extent to which the radio program has contributed to some of these changes, and how these changes in knowledge, attitude, and practice can also contribute to a change in higher level indicators around gender equality, well-being, quality of life, resilience, and some of these indicators and so on. And of course, there's a whole range of indicators around the capacity of the different stakeholders, the broadcasters, the rural communities, to participate and get involved in these learning platforms. Now, in many cases, and again, going back to this idea of traditional M&E, we are still working with these like surveys, different qualitative tools, focus group discussion, and things like that. And part of it, and this may be a topic of discussion, part of it is kind of to answer funders and donors' requests to have these kind of numbers and targets and things like that. So that's something we work with. But for some of these indicators, we're also looking in terms of a more ongoing process by which we gather data on as we go along during the program, and that informs our activities and so on. This is closer to that concept of adaptive learning. And I've highlighted here this idea of ULISA data that I will be talking a bit more about. So just an example here of this idea of reach that we associated with working with radio. And this is an example of a project aimed at developing interactive radio platforms to strengthen and complement extension and advisory services of the Ministry of Food and Agriculture in Ghana. So in total, we had 16 radio stations with a potential to reach about 12 million people, 15 to 65 years old. So this again illustrates, and then we have the coverage here in Ghana. So you can see that now there's an element of interest here in this idea that we can scale through the large reach of radio stations. The other is just to show a more typical kind of assessment that we do around knowledge, attitude, and practice. In this case, we're like more typically comparing, let's say, the level of use of certain practices at baseline, and then at end line, and then at end line comparing people who have listened or not listeners to the program, using more like more typical survey approach, like probabilistic sampling strategies and things like that. So again, this is more of a typical or traditional M&E kind of component that we are still having to use in terms of responding to demands by funders and so on. So this particular one was in a project in Ethiopia around controlling the infestation by the fall armyworm. So just to kind of put that as something, highlight and the fact that this is still something that is an important component of our overall M&E work. However, like I said before, I'd like to focus a bit more on this kind of role of interactive radio and its potential, and that's something that we're kind of developing as we speak, to play a role in a more adaptive learning process and approach. So the idea here is quite simple in a sense that it's based on this combination of traditional radio, which, as we know, is widespread, is accessible, it's convenient, inexpensive. So even though radio is sometimes viewed as an old technology, it remains a crucial source of information for rural populations of Africa. However, often in development initiatives, radio is used in a kind of a conventional way as a tool to disseminate or push messages or information in a unidirectional way. So I think that by bringing this, the digital component into it, we can create a more interactive use of radio that allows for listeners to participate more actively in the radio program, in adjusting the content and so on. But also the digital tools provide also opportunities for collecting data, information, and also offering a diversity of channels of communication that will complement and strengthen what is being done with the radio. So if we look at our application, and we have a Nuliza application that has been developed by Farm Radio to facilitate this interaction, this interactive radio approach. So it is, the application is used to power mobile-based services for sharing information and gathering feedback through mobile interactions. So this allows users to send and receive data using any basic mobile phone, and then it allows us to present data in real time. So as we implement the radio program, and as we go and as we move and discuss different topics, this can be that conversation that is taking place in real time. So more in details, let's see how it is implemented. So basically, what we have is during the design of the radio program, we have we identify as the group there, the different stakeholders, the broadcasters, identify what questions could be used for different episodes. And these questions can be used to trigger conversation, to assess the level of knowledge, attitude, or use of certain practices. It can be used in different ways. And the team will determine what is more relevant in terms of that. Then the stations can announce these poll questions on air and then give a number that people can call, and then they hang up, and then the system will call them back, and then they're invited to either answer a poll question, like a few multiple choice, or they could even leave a comment, leave an answer, have a question of their own, and things like that. That is being done through a recording. And then after that, this data is being kind of compiled on the ULISA platform, and it's available in real time. And then the broadcasters, the other stakeholders involved in the program can then use that information live, almost to be able to use that in their program. And then some of the data can also be compiled and shared with stakeholders to be able to use and inform their actions and so on. So that gives kind of this dynamic process by which feedback from listeners and so on can be used to adjust the program and even activities and so on. So that's the component that has some similarity. I would not necessarily that is like a full adaptive learning approach as presented by Katie before, but it has these elements that we'd like to build upon. Now, just an example here from a project on girls' education in conflict areas in Mali. In this case, the radio program type that we were using is a drama plus, which is basically a play with actors and so on the radio, but it is kind of complemented by discussions by different stakeholders and to address certain topics. And in this particular case, for example, we had a question that was about the play itself. Like, for example, in this case, it was what justifies or explains the fact that the fathers of Sally, one of the characters, was upset at her. And then people have different choices. They can select what they think is their view about this question. And then this is being used then to feed into a conversation, to maybe highlight certain issues and so on. So that becomes a very dynamic way to engage the listeners and having them part of this conversation. And then after that, we have, in some cases, other questions that will be more about, okay, what type of silos are you using to store grains, or are you using organic fertilizer? Sometimes it can be things that are more like about specific practices. So just in brief, we have that interaction provides a bit of a two-way communication tool that allows listeners to ask questions, provide feedback, and then learn from each other. It allows broadcaster and other stakeholders to adjust the content of their radio programs on an ongoing basis. And it will also generate real-time data that can be shared with different decision makers and other stakeholders. And so as I said before, we are still working a lot with these more traditional approaches, but increasingly we are working towards developing more of these more adaptive learning approaches, because we think that they would provide a very rich way to address some of the issues that we're trying to tackle, as Katie mentioned, working in very complex and diverse environment. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Bernard. That's a great example and illustration. And two of the things I really like about what you described, I like that it's involved not only in sort of engaging people in monitoring, but actually engaging the intended beneficiaries of the intervention actually in the intervention itself. So they actually become sort of co-owners and co-creators, it sounds like, of the project. So I think that's so important, because often we talk about donor demands or reporting accountabilities being the drivers of demand for monitoring and evaluation. But actually, that's a very backwards way to look at it, because it's the people who are meant to be benefiting from the work we're doing that should really be the ones who care the most about whether the radio program is working, whether it's relevant to their lives and priorities, and whether they're feeling the positive impacts of it. So I think that's a really great example. There's a really interesting question in the chat about the sort of cultural mindset shift that's required for this type of approach to adaptive learning. And it's posed to Katie, but I would actually love to hear all three of your views on it. So maybe I will go ahead and actually turn it over to Vijay and encourage others to put their questions in the chat. But if I can abuse my power as the moderator, I'll go ahead and let's hear a bit more from Vijay, a different example, a different type of approach. And maybe we can start to explore the extent to which, we can identify drivers of the different approaches, and why do the approaches look slightly different? Maybe they look like the model Katie presented, maybe they look different, and it's interesting to compare. So Vijay, can we go over to you, please? Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Megan. And it's indeed a pleasure to be on this call and with so many wonderful people. And it's indeed a tough act to follow, with what Katie spoke about, and also in terms of what Bernard really touched upon. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation, considering we share a lot of the common learning that Bernard definitely talked about, and I'm hoping that I'm able to add value based on Gram Vaani's perspective, leveraging some of the technology tools that we utilize in terms of engaging with the communities. Yes, sure. Thank you so much. So, hi everybody. I'm Vijay Pretap, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Gram Vaani. We build tech-based innovations powering community-led development for the next billion. Very glad to be part of this conversation. What we will try and do is to cover some key aspects in terms of starting off with why we use voice as a medium for conversations with the communities that we engage with. We primarily work on voice-based technologies. I will try and touch upon quickly, providing an overview about Gram Vaani's work. Gram Vaani is a Hindi word, in the Hindi language. It translates to voice of the village. I will then talk very quickly about Gram Vaani's theory of change. I think that's where some key elements about why we do what we do sort of will come out, and we'll also follow it up with some appropriate technology tools that we have developed that help in the process of concurrent monitoring and evaluation of the programs, and importantly, making the users or the communities part of the conversations, and why MLE is not an end objective, but it is part of the journey. Let me just quickly touch upon Gram Vaani. We are a voice-first social tech enterprise creating bottom-up participatory tech platforms that empower underserved communities in low-resource and remote settings. We use voice as a medium, considering that it helps systems and platforms leapfrog the dependence on literacy. It also helps communities engage with the platforms in a much more relatable and in a much more convenient way. In the Indian context, we also did some very quick research studies on the ground with the communities we work with to understand why they prefer voice as a medium. And it kind of very clearly validates that the use of voice has been quite underestimated in many ways across the development ecosystem. And we believe that it should be leveraged even better and in fact, utilized across many more programs, considering the prevalence and the ease of use for communities. Let me just quickly talk about Gram Vaani's work. Gram Vaani, as I said, builds voice-based participatory media platforms. We spoke about radio as a medium. We definitely ride and build on top of the radio platform. What we have done is actually replicated the radio engagement experience using the mobile phone, where people just have to give a call. They get a call back from our platform and they listen to content like a radio. And it is in fact an interactive platform where people not just are able to listen to information, but are also able to engage with it by asking questions, sharing their opinions and views. Think of it almost like a social media platform, but on voice. And that sort of helps us engage with the communities in a much more near real-time manner. We have touched about 3 million lives. We worked with 150 plus partners across the spectrum of health, gender, child rights, governance, agriculture, livelihood, and we are that perfect horizontal platform working with communities across developmental issues. We have been awarded and recognized across various fora, and in fact, we work across various technology platforms, leveraging the power of voice, starting off with IVR, which is interactive voice response. We now have it through the Mobile Vaani Smart app and also through intelligent voice tools, where we've developed something like a voice-based Quora of sorts. So I will talk more about work that we do. As I said, Mobile Vaani, which is basically our flagship solution, is an innovative voice-based federated network of participatory media platforms. What we believe is that policies can work, but policies will work only when communities understand the reasons why some of the inequalities exist, when they understand the social, cultural, and economic factors that lead to some of these inequalities. But if people have to understand these inequalities, they need to be able to have conversations. They need to be able to have information which is contextual in their vernacular language and are able to engage and interact on these topics. However, conventional media platforms do not provide for that easy engagement, which is why we have built this decentralized hyperlocal instances of voice platforms that people can interact and discuss these local topics. So what I will do now is talk quickly about the theory of change. For us, when we fundamentally believe that communities have to be part of the conversations, we ensure that they are part of the content creation process as well. We understand the needs of the communities, co-create content with the communities, and ensure that they are part of the conversations. We trigger conversations on important topics and ensure that the communities have enough representation in terms of these conversations. And how do we do that? Apart from content creation, we also ensure that community volunteers who we identify from the communities are able to drive home this point by engaging with the communities, ensuring that they are brought onto this platform, onboarding them, and they are able to listen to the content and are also able to participate. And we do this with the help of appropriate technology and with the help of community mobilization and ownership. What this leads to is bottom-up voice creation, voices, which means communities are able to contribute their opinions, their views, their questions on the same platform against the same content that is published on the platform on these topics. And this generates ground truth, which means voices from the communities on various topics. And this is the evidence that we use for policy advocacy, policy conversations, and also use it to share it across the media to drive more collective action on these topics. So this is the broad theory of change that Gram Vaani works with. As I said, we work with, this is the three-pronged approach. One is accessible technology, two is creating contextual content, and ensuring community participation and ownership. We focus on two very important aspects, three very important aspects: the context of the content, the completeness of the content, and importantly, the credibility of these messages. Now, this is where the role of the community volunteers, the role of the community participation is of utmost importance. We have done programs across various topics relating to family health, sexual health, state of financial services access, government schemes and programs. And all these topics are very contextual to the community's needs, and they are triggered on these platforms, and they allow the communities to have these conversations. And all these voices that get generated, including questions, comments, opinions, are used by local volunteers and by Gram Vaani in collaboration with partners to drive policy advocacy. This is the community media platform that I was talking about, where people just have to give a call to a number, they get a call back on the platform, and they are able to listen to content in the local language, and they're able to engage with that content and ask questions, share their opinions, and these voices are used for policy advocacy. As I said, we have the voice-based platforms available across people who do not have smartphones, simple feature phones, smartphones, and also through very intelligent tools like a voice-based Quora of sorts. So these are some of the examples that we have used to explain this whole process. Like during the COVID times, when we leveraged our network of community media platforms, this is almost like an on-demand radio, and people are able to leverage these platforms to access important information around COVID-related health precautions, which is provided by the government, by the local institutions. Based on the user responses, we are then able to provide them with subsequent information. Based on the user inputs or questions, we are able to address those queries. And based on the trends that we are able to watch in terms of the kind of questions, kind of comments, kind of opinions, we are then able to work with local institutions to drive more informed policy advocacy and also monitoring of the programs. Now, which is where the value of concurrent monitoring, which is in many ways is adaptive learning, is what Gram Vaani has been adopting across our programs. Considering the amount of investment that goes into many of these programs, I think it is imperative, and I think it's the responsibility of all of us to ensure that monitoring is not an end of program process, but part of the whole design and implementation, which is where we ensure that we have our ears to the ground, we ensure that we know what clicks, we are able to join the dots by working with the local communities and bringing that context into those conversations, and then derive what actions needed to be taken. And that is where the data, the importance of data becomes absolutely imperative. And we've done this again through various other efforts, like, for example, leveraging community participation in terms of monitoring of health services, in terms of their contribution to the COVID-related programs, in terms of monitoring the prevalence of vaccination access, and also in terms of fear of vaccination in many ways as well, for example. Right? That's exactly why I said MLE is part of our program design process, and we do it through surveys, voice-based surveys. We do it through focus group discussions on the ground as the program progresses, and the data that we capture through the platform, through the data analytics that we get on the platform, we are able to concurrently and on the go be able to change the program design, and also in terms of the content that is delivered for the communities. We also use these opinions and also layer a lot of the macro socioeconomic data to sort of get a better understanding of the the sort of voices and the quality of voices that we get from the ground. Again, as I said, we use it for grievance redressal, we use it for policy action, we use these voices and the data that we capture from the platforms for much more informed policy making. These are some of the examples, right? So for example, we've used it for behavior change programs, and how the data has helped us with tracking the audience in real time. We've done it for knowledge attitude and improvement measurement on the go. We've done it with the qualitative content that we get on the platform, helps us with a lot of insights, a lot of information that helps us to understand what are the barriers to change, right? Especially within the communities, be it with regards to awareness improvement or with regards to the behavior change components as well. We are also able to incorporate a lot of A/B testing with regards to content, and that helps us with very quickly making changes with regards to what content is working, what content is not. This is all the data analytics that we are able to reflect through our data platform, and helps us make these very important decisions. I'll quickly skip through some of these slides. These are examples of how we leverage the whole process of concurrent monitoring, adaptive learning, and the MLE processes incorporated as part of our program design process. This is a report that we had generated through the first 100 days of COVID in India, and it is available on our website as well. What really makes GV systems stand out and really bring us working very closely with a lot of stakeholders across the ecosystem is, firstly, it's an inclusive technology, right? It is on-demand radio. People can access it at any point of time. It's voice-driven. It's accessible across multiple channels. Its diligently designed analytical framework provides a lot of feedback loops and user centricity. The bottom-up nature of the platform helps us generate a lot of ground truth and evidence. And the last part is the ability to do concurrent monitoring helps us improve the efficiency of the program implementation and learnings that come out of the program. And the last slide, where the need for empathy to listen and respond quickly, which is what drives trust. And we emphasize on the value of trust because these platforms are able to generate the user engagement. Because we have been able to engage with the communities, we have allowed the communities to be part of the content creation and the platform operations as well. Communities deserve to get a better access to the data and insights that we gather from the platform because they are the source, but they need to know what the data is being used for. They need to be able to use the data for more data-driven accountability within the communities and with local institutions. And that's where it's important to have an ear to the ground while designing technology campaigns and make the communities and local institutions as partners in the whole process. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I really hope to address some of the questions as part of the conversation goes along. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for taking a little longer than I should have.
That's all right. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we would all like to hear even more. We will be sharing the slides and the recording, so you can get a chance to hear more from Vijay. We have about 5 minutes now until we'd like to break into the discussion groups. Of course, the discussions will continue there, but let's take a few of these questions. So the first one I'd like to put to all three of you. It's a really good question from one of the participants saying that what you're describing sounds like it requires a mindset shift in how we think about monitoring and evaluation. And it sounds to me like this is even, we could think of it as an institutional cultural shift. So how have you found it? And particularly Bernard and Vijay, were your organizations always using these agile, active monitoring and participatory approaches, or did you require some sort of changes? And if so, what allowed you or enabled you to do that? And how did you bring along the staff? I noticed, that you have sort of many of the usual suspects, USAID, World Bank, different foundations as your funders, who I guess are proponents of what we've termed the evil traditional approaches. So, was it your funders that enabled you to do this? Was it charismatic leaders like yourselves, or how did you achieve it? And what can you tell us about the sort of mindset shift? Maybe we'll go to you first, Vijay, and then we'll go in reverse order back to Bernard and Katie.
No, Megan, I think this is a very important question, fundamentally because for Gram Vaani, the mission has been to reverse the flow of information. The challenge that we are fighting is that conventional platforms do not allow people to be part of the conversation, being part of the narrative, right? So that is the mission statement we are working with. So the whole process of participatory approaches has been part of our whole design and implementation process right from the word go. And I think as we go along, and while we acknowledge the need and probably the demand for traditional approaches for MLE by conventional funders for whatever reason, but I think in our own I think we realize our responsibility more so towards the communities. The data that we capture from them, the information that we capture from them, I think they deserve to know more. And what are we doing about it? What can they do with the data? Can we help them? Can we build their agency to use that data for local data-driven accountability? Can they use that data to question local institutions in terms of access to better services? Right. I think the responsibility is more so towards the communities, and of course then to the ecosystem, and which is where we began the journey, and we continue to do so. And I think even from a cost efficiency standpoint, it only helps us, keep our ears to ground and ensure that the content that's generated, created, programs that are designed are more sort of nimble and are able to adapt to the community's needs rather than doing it as a post facto sort of an effort.
That's great. And I love this idea of not only that those who are providing data should have access to their own data, but also to be enabled or provide an enabling environment where they can actually use those data for accountability. That's great. Bernard, any thoughts on the cultural shift required to adopt these types of approaches?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm going to build on what Vijay started, and I agree with what he's been saying. I mean, at FarmRadio, we always had this idea of giving a voice to smallholder farmers, to rural communities, so and having them involved at the different stages and so on. So this has always been part of it, and the innovation aspect of it through like the mobile phone and everything came also with this idea of giving them a voice, this kind of, initially this whole interactive part was mostly viewed or considered as part of the radio program itself to make it dynamic, interactive, interesting, engaging. And then at some point from an M&E perspective, this is where maybe the shift is taking place at the organizational level to say, how can we build on that and use that more in terms of to follow what Vijay is mentioning, to get this kind of a more participatory involvement at the monitoring and evaluation stage and things like that. So we are in that process of, and some of it is very practical. Some of the constraint of doing these large household surveys, as you all know, they're expensive and they're also a bit static. You do it at the baseline, then at the end line, and then you have these two pictures that are kind of, they do not capture the more dynamic process taking place. So I think that from a philosophical point of view, we always at the heart this kind of engaging local communities, giving them a voice, a sense of agency in terms of having a say in the decision that affects their lives. But on the M&E side, we're trying to see how we can also bring that more participatory component into it. But at the same time, we do still have requirements from funders about, okay, how many people have adopted the practices? And then when you work with projects that have a large scale, like of like, I don't know, 12 million potential audience, then it becomes a challenge methodologically to say, how do we provide these numbers without doing all these surveys and things like that? So we're thinking about that, because these as a modest NGO in terms of size, these surveys and everything, they're very expensive, costly. Often we need to work with sample size that are like lower what we would need to get the precisions we need and things like that. So I think there is a bit of that thinking going on right now to see how do we adapt this to the more M&E component to make it more agile, in a way, more adaptive and so on.
Yeah, so scaling not only the successful interventions, but also how do we scale the M&E approaches themselves,
yes.
And make sure that we're able to use them at scale. Great thoughts there. And I see that Ian is already responding to several of the more technical questions in the chat. So that's great. And maybe other speakers can do that as well. Katie, please share your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, and looking at the time, I'll keep it brief just because I did share a very long response to that in the chat. But I will say that in terms of that mindset shift, I think it's interesting that we oftentimes think of the work or the implementation and then the M&E as this separate piece. And I think there is this fundamental mindset shift about when we're talking adaptive learning, that isn't something separate from the implementation, it is the implementation. And it's just allowing us to implement in a more nimble, adaptive way so that we're iterating as we go along, but it's not some separate activity. It's fully integrated into the implementation, into the launch, the testing, this, scaling up. And so I think that is one of the bigger mindset shifts that we've had to focus on when we're serving as a learning partner to implementing organizations, and making sure that we're able to work shoulder to shoulder or side by side, because we're not some separate M&E team. We are a learning partner working closely with them throughout every stage of the process.
Yeah, great. Some really interesting points there. And I'm sure that will spark additional discussion in the conversations. Given the time, I would like to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms, but there are several questions in the chat about potential for bias, selection bias, and who has access to the mobile technologies or the radio technologies that you described. So maybe it would be great if you could start off in your various groups talking about those issues, maybe sharing some of the figures when you talk about the reach, how does that compare to, for example, exclusion and poverty figures in the communities you're working in? So with that, and again, of course, we've got lots more in the chat than we can cover, but yes, please do address those in your groups. So we will now break out into a number of groups. You will have an invitation that will pop up at the bottom of your screen, and please accept the invitation to go into the group. We'll have about 20 minutes, a little bit less, about 15 minutes in the small groups. And this will be an opportunity for you to share information and discuss amongst your partners. Si vous parlez français, vous pouvez rester dans le groupe principal avec moi. I think it's too late. People have gone to the other rooms. Could we broadcast a message to all rooms? I will broadcast it now. Okay, so we will continue here. Nous avons l'interprète encore avec nous. Donc, si vous souhaitez rester ici avec nous, on va avoir aussi notre propre breakout group. So we will have a breakout group here in the main room. For those of you speaking English, feel free to stay with us then. So let's go ahead and open it up. Any thoughts or reactions on this question of bias? And maybe Ian, can I turn to you? I saw you were answering many of the questions in the chat already, but do you have any thoughts on these questions about access and bias? I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much. I assume when you mean bias, you're referring to the questions about how would programming engage with folks that don't necessarily have radio sets or mobile phones?
Yes, and I think the idea that potentially there may be sort of systemic gaps in terms of who's accessing the technologies or who's not.
Right. I would leave the sort of questions about the implications for evaluation, perhaps to Bernard if he's still here. But I would say that in our work in general, we are, for the most part, it's a generalization, but we're working in contexts where we know that radio listenership, radio set ownership is generally very high. Now, that is not true everywhere, but in the majority of geographies that we're working in, that's primarily what motivates us to use radio. So the kind of things that we would do is that before we start on any program, we always do audience research to better understand the listening preferences of audiences. Now, that won't overcome people who are not listening to radio at all, but it will allow us to maximize the extent to which the choices that we're making about the radio stations, the timing of programs, and the general approach that we would be using, that we are meeting the preferences of audiences and trying to tap into those very high percentages that are usually reported in terms of people who have access to radio. So one of the challenges, people may have access, but they don't actually use it. How we can address people who have no access at all? Well, I mean, perhaps the best way I think that we do it is to work through community listening and action groups. Now, it's not going to address all of those gaps in terms of listenership, but in immediate areas it will help. And the other way is to ensure that we're not operating independently of groups that use more traditional media like face-to-face interactive, face-to-face and interpersonal interactions. That could be through groups, but also we might be working with an agency that has their own social networks or their own networks, wherein we'd be trying to push people towards listening to those programs and having those groups help us to advertise them.
Thank you so much for that, and really some interesting insights. So let's hear from others. This is an opportunity for networking. What questions came up for you from the presentations, and what would you like to hear more about? Have you used any similar approaches in your own work? I believe you can unmute, but if you can't, please let us know. Yes, Olivia, please go ahead. Oh, sorry, no, it's Danielle, I see. Danielle, please go ahead. Let us know where you're calling from today. Danielle Kusi-Agyei. If you're speaking, we cannot hear you. Yes, there you go.
Oui, merci pour ce moment. Je suis Daniel Makassi depuis la RDC. Moi, j'utilise déjà Ulisa, la plateforme Ulisa avec Femmes Radio International. C'est pour nous une première expérience. Au début, ce n'était pas facile parce qu'il faut aller montrer aux radios comment ça marche. Il fallait qu'il y ait un numéro que chaque radio devrait utiliser pour faciliter l'interaction. Et nous avons utilisé la plateforme Ulisa dans le cadre de la campagne VAX. Et d'ailleurs, c'est une campagne qui est encore en cours au niveau de la RDC. RDC où nous participons avec 10 radios au total. Ces 10 radios font partie de 2 provinces de la région swahiliphone en République démocratique du Congo. Et dans seulement 7 semaines, nous étions déjà à plus de 3000 auditeurs qui ont appelé à travers les systèmes ULISA. Donc, c'est pour nous une première expérience et aussi une façon pour nous de comprendre comment est-ce que les radios peuvent utiliser les nouvelles technologies de l'information pour servir les communautés rurales affectées par COVID-19. Merci.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Merci beaucoup. Really interesting to hear about another use of the same tool of ULISA from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Really interesting. Do others have questions you'd like to share? I guess one question that jumped out to me was about our tendency to look for kind of technology-based innovations that we would like to scale. And I wonder if any of our speakers might talk about that. And, you know, are we always looking for a new sort of silver bullet or latest trend in terms of technology that we want to take to scale? Do these approaches work for maybe less exciting or less new technologies like midwife care or other types of sort of proven, tried and true interventions? Maybe Tara, you might have some ideas?
Sure. Just to introduce myself briefly, I'm Tara at Farm Radio. You know, it's a really interesting question because, you know, what we're doing and what we're thinking about is how to almost create societal or behavior change using communications. So we're always looking to, you know, kind of support the interventions that are already in place or encourage their use or create societal change towards those sorts of things. And it's funny that you mentioned technology and when we're talking about this sort of thing, you know, we've mentioned mobile phones, we've mentioned ULISA, we've mentioned all of our interactivity platforms, but when it comes down to it, radio is itself an old technology. It's often people look at it and they go, well, why would you still use that? That's old, it makes no sense. Like it's not blockchain technology. It's not this new thing that we could be doing. And, you know, really, in many ways, we're doing it because it works. And we're doing it because it reaches places that maybe don't have mobile phones necessarily, even though we can use those new technologies to augment and support the things that we're already doing. And then when you go over to monitoring and evaluation, again, you know, we're talking about using those interactive technologies to measure and to find new things and to create feedback loops within this older technology. But it's still at its heart very, very simple. It's calling a number on a mobile phone that someone on the other end will pick up, or, you know, a lot of these things are systems that people are already doing and already using. We're just using them to support other things. So you mentioned, you know, supporting midwifery, you know, in some cases we're using communication and radio to support people being able to access those places or to learn about how and when they should be going to these places and using it.
Great, really helpful. Thank you for those insights. Let's hear from others. Others have thoughts. What was your reaction? How did what you heard from the partners relate to what you've done in your own organizations? I see we have colleagues here from UN Women, from Global Affairs Canada, I think. A couple of other colleagues. Anyone like to share their own reflections or their own experience?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is...
Hi, Timimba. Welcome. Thank you. Please go ahead.
So I will give I'm not from a development organization. I'm rather from private sector. So I'm going to speak from private sector perspective. and the challenges we have with the development partners when we come together. I have the impression that the approach that we're talking about today is more adapted to us in our way of doing things, especially when we innovate. You know, when you innovate, you don't have a straight road. It's bumpy. Then sometimes you come back and then you move a little bit, two steps, and then you come back 3 steps, because that's what innovation is about. So with the strict traditional M&E, it's so confusing. And I still have problems with some of my partners because they want to finance innovation, but they don't want to accept sometimes what innovation means. It means that you fail, you try several different ways of doing things. And this is where I put a note on Uliza could be very helpful for us. And quite frankly, Farm Radio International will be very helpful for us because we're trying to have some behavior change on the farmer's side, especially financial literacy. It's a behavior change, it's a mindset change. So having a team like Farm Radio International is very, very helpful because there are more radios in the rural areas than TV or phones. This is how it still is. So you use the tool that you have and that is available and that people are comfortable with. So I just wanted to share that from a private sector perspective, especially investment in financing.
Great, thank you. Yes, really interesting to hear about a slightly different perspective, as you've said, but also it sounds like you've seen many parallels there in terms of what you're trying to achieve for behavior change and how some of these tools might be really useful. Great. Others have thoughts or reactions?
Yeah, hello, good afternoon.
Hi, Aaron, thank you. Please go ahead.
Yes, my name is Aaron and I work for Farm Radio International. I'm based in Ghana as Business Development Advisor. It's just an experience going on the field, trying to market radio and as well, radio, what is so special about radio? And then you sometimes feel like, you know, when I began my assignments with Farm Radio International, it took time for me to understand some of this adaptive way of doing things and how it benefits organizations. And that is my selling point. That is my selling tool. Radio is still powerful. I keep on telling people, I mean, it shouldn't happen. Don't expect it, but any military coup that will happen, Ghana Broadcasting Corporation is the house they are going for first. It's not on any television. And then the voice from radio is still very powerful. Even when you are driving, sometimes you watch television, but you still want to listen to radio in Ghana. Many people do that. You listen to it because there is some form of authenticity, there is some form of authority and reliability with regards to the information that comes from radio. And these are some of the things we use to convince people. When you are driving, you use radio. Of course, you cannot be watching television. So radio is still here with us. It's powerful and it will not go away. Also simply because in the development world, the people who want to reach, many of them do not, they are not lettered, they cannot write, they cannot read. So all they need is voice. And if the person cannot speak English, how do you translate this in a form that we can improve knowledge and change attitude? So radio is still so much of an essential to the development world that we should continue to drum for people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for sharing those ideas from Ghana. Great.
So this is just my face.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much for being here. And yeah, I think you're right about the need for tools that can be used for people with different levels of literacy. And I thought that was very interesting with the example from India, that they not only are using radio and options for sending messages to people, but also using voice to gather input from people. And I think Vijay mentioned that they think voice is, an underutilized tool, and we rely a lot on paper, which seems very true to me. Others have experiences they'd like to share. We'd love to hear from others. You can feel free to just unmute and start speaking. Et vous pouvez parler en français aussi. Nous avons toujours notre interprète. Merci beaucoup à l'interprète. Si vous préférez vous exprimer en français, soyez le bienvenu. On aimerait écouter des autres expériences, des autres questions. Alphonse, oui, allez-y, merci.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis très heureux d'entendre tout ce que je viens d'entendre et les témoignages qui ont été faits et partagés au sujet justement de l'importance de la radio et des outils ULISA. Moi, j'ai travaillé avec Radio Rurale Internationale sur un projet qui est terminé du côté du Togo en tant que chargé des métiers radiophoniques. Et pour avoir travaillé avec les radios rurales sur l'ensemble du territoire togolais pendant 13 mois sur un projet, moi-même étant spécialiste de la radio, je fais 20 ans dans la radio. Je peux vous témoigner qu'avec les différents outils que Radio Rurale Internationale a pu mettre à notre disposition, il y a eu un véritable changement de comportement et d'action au niveau des communautés rurales. C'était un projet que nous avons déroulé dans l'Express, mais en pleine période de Covid et à distance pour une bonne partie, mais qui a, avec les différents outils, notamment ULISA, a donné la parole aux couches défavorisées, les femmes notamment, qui dans des communautés dans le nord du pays n'avaient pas souvent droit à la parole, qui ont pu, dans leur champ ou depuis leur lieu de maison, même en étant la cuisine, participer à des émissions en amont, en répondant à des questions, et en participant en direct à des émissions. Et c'est tout à fait normal que la radio est l'outil de communication le mieux adapté aujourd'hui pour des activités de développement, des projets de développement, des projets qui doivent toucher les communautés à la base. Donc, je voudrais juste partager ce petit témoignage avec vous en disant que en 13 mois, nous avons créé un grand mouvement, un grand, on va dire, bouleversement positif dans le concept genre même dans le pays à travers les radios qui nous ont suivis à travers deux plans principaux, c'est-à-dire une programmation d'impact qui a permis à des radios de produire des émissions et une programmation basée que nous avons appelé le Script Plus, qui aussi a permis aux radios de produire des émissions, mais spécifiquement sur des questions de changement climatique. Voilà, pour ne pas trop monopoliser la parole, je voudrais saluer tous les collègues, les anciens collègues que j'espère bientôt retrouver de Radio Rurale Internationale qui sont dans la réunion.
Merci beaucoup, Alphonse, pour votre témoignage de Togo. J'apprécie beaucoup d'apprendre sur tous les fans de ULISA et de radio. C'est très intéressant. Malheureusement, nous allons terminer notre temps d'échange en petits groupes. Donc, merci beaucoup pour vos participations, vos questions. N'hésitez pas à rajouter des questions dans le chat. Et je pense que les autres collègues vont nous rejoindre dans quelques instants. Nous avons encore 1 minute, donc si quelqu'un d'autre aimerait rajouter quelque chose, we have 1 more minute in the group. If anyone else would like to add a final question or a final thought.
Maybe I'll go ahead and just close this out since everyone has been so flattering to our organization. But I thought the point that was made earlier from outside of farm radio was really interesting, and that thought of being able to fail and try again and know when things aren't working and continue to do those things. And again, you know, as we've heard over and over again, we've seen this from our ULISA systems that allow us to do that. And in some cases, we've changed the entire focus of a radio program just based off of what people are telling us. We can't grow food because there's drought, so let's do programming about drought or things like that. And having that ability to get live feedback in any sort of circumstance is super useful. So thank you to everyone who was able to comment and give testimonials, but also come at it from a different point of view and that sort of thing. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tara, and welcome back to all of the colleagues. I hope your small breakout rooms were as interesting as ours. I think in our section, we heard a lot of fans of radio and of ULISA in particular, and I think really interesting stories about how radio can be used to reach communities, but not just reach them, also engage them in citizens' life and hear voices that maybe are ignored in other contexts. Vijay, there was also a lot of enthusiasm for learning more about how you're using voice-based technology that aren't reliant on literacy. So really interesting points there, thank you. And with that, I'd like to end today's session. I would like to thank Vijay, Bernard, and Katie for your input and for your time and generosity of time responding to questions. I'd also like to thank the organizers and the interpreters. Thank you so much for making it accessible event for our Francophone colleagues. And I would like to thank the audience for taking the time to join. In our session, Tanemba, Alphonse, Danielle, and others shared their own experiences and brought in different perspectives, as we just heard from Tara, which really enriched the conversation for me and I'm sure for others as well. The MLC team will circulate a form where you can signal if you would be interested in connecting with any of the speakers that you've heard today. So using that form, you can reach out or pose questions and we will facilitate introductions. In particular, we will also follow up with the recordings and the PowerPoint presentations, and MLC will soon be announcing its new members. So those who were successful through the application process and will be joining the Million Lives Collective in 2022, which I'm sure we will all be excited to see this new cohort of partners. You can find more information on their website, of course, and we've also shared other resources in the chat, so please do take the time to grab those. Thank you very much, everyone, and good luck with your own journeys on adaptive learning and iterative approaches to understanding what's working, who it's working for, and why, so that we can take to scale all of these exciting innovations, which is, of course, a strong imperative in today's context where there is so much need and we need to achieve more much more quickly. So appreciate your time today and have a lovely evening and a nice day.
Same to you. Bye-bye. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.